Welcome to the Lost Sci-Fi Story channel. If you're ready, let's begin today's story.
Orvin Tale had, in 31 years of service to the imperial household, developed a relationship with routine that most people reserve for close family members. Intimate, load-bearing, occasionally suffocating, but ultimately the thing around which a life is organized. He woke at 04:00 Imperial Standard Time. He reviewed the night log by 04:10. He walked the East Corridor by 04:15 and by 04:17 he stood outside the Empress's quarters for the daily confirmation of presence, which was a formal protocol with a formal name that amounted, in practice, to Orvin Tale listening for 30 seconds at a closed door to confirm that a woman who had ruled 300 star systems for 19 years had not, overnight, ceased to exist. It was not a glamorous duty. It was, however, his. On the morning that changed everything, he listened at the door for the usual 30 seconds and heard nothing unusual, because the unusual thing was not a sound but an absence of one, a quality of silence that was somehow different from sleeping silence, emptier than it should have been, with a texture that pressed back against his attention in a way he could not immediately name. He opened the door. He stood in the doorway. The junior attendant beside him, a young man named Fess who had been in his posting for 4 months, and whose primary qualification appeared to be an ability to stand very still for extended periods, waited politely, then waited less politely, then said, "Sir," and received no answer, then said, "Sir," a second time with the careful emphasis of someone who suspects they are about to be involved in something that will define the rest of their career in ways they have not yet had time to consider. Orvin Tale turned. His face, in Fess's later account, had acquired the color of raw durasteel left out in winter, which is to say, a gray so complete it was almost philosophical. He said, in a voice entirely devoid of the particular quality that voices have when their owners believe things are going to be all right, "The Empress is not where she should be." Fess looked past him into the empty quarters. Then he looked back at Orvin Tale. Then, because he was 23 years old and had grown up in the outer systems where directness was considered a virtue, he said, "Should I press something? There must be a button for this." There was, in fact, a button for this. Orvin Tale pressed it himself, because some responsibilities cannot be delegated, and because Fess looked like he might press the wrong one. What followed was the activation of the palace security apparatus in full, a system of such extraordinary sophistication and redundancy that it had been designed, at considerable expense, to respond to every conceivable threat to the imperial sovereign. Assassination, kidnapping, hostile boarding action, biological contamination, structural failure, political coup. It had not been designed with any particular care for the scenario in which the imperial sovereign had simply left of her own volition in civilian clothes with a single bag at 23:52 the previous evening, walking past camera array 94 with her shoulders set in the posture of someone who has made a decision and is done reviewing it. The footage from camera 94 was the first hard fact in a morning that was quickly becoming defined by the absence of them. She was there, violet black hair, the faint iridescent quality of her skin catching the corridor lighting in that way it always did, 4 long fingers wrapped around the strap of a bag that contained, as far as anyone could determine, nothing from her official inventory. And then she was not there. The corridor was empty. Bay 12, when checked, was also empty. The private transport that had been registered there under a civilian name, an older model, small and unremarkable and equipped with hardware old enough to predate the Imperial Tracking Network's integration by a comfortable margin, was gone. Pelion delivered this last piece of information to the emergency council session, with an expression of such careful professional neutrality that Councillor Sav, who had known Pelion for 16 years, recognized it immediately as the expression Pelion wore when deeply, profoundly mortified and determined that no one would know it. The vessel's hardware, Pelion said, in a tone normally used to announce things like favorable harvest projections, predates integration. It would not appear in the tracking network. A pause. At all. Another pause shorter. We are looking into how it came to be in Bay 12. This last sentence was delivered with such evenness that it took the room a full 10 seconds to understand that the chief of Imperial Intelligence was saying, in the most controlled possible way, that her own department had no idea, and that this was, professionally speaking, a situation. Admiral Das, who had arrived at the session with his uniform immaculate, and his expression that of a man expecting to be given something to shoot, had been growing steadily quieter as the meeting progressed, which those who knew him understood as a more alarming sign than shouting would have been. He stared at the star map his aide had pulled up, showing the range of the missing shuttle, and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "Begin search pattern. Every system within 3 weeks' travel." He paused. "Tell them we're running a training exercise." Sav looked at him. "They will not believe that." "No," said Das, "but it will give them something to do while they don't believe it, and that is more than we currently have." Orville stood at the back of the chamber through all of it, hands clasped behind his back, eyes moving periodically to the empty chair at the head of the council table, her chair, which no one would sit in, which had become in the space of 4 hours a kind of monument to a fact no one had yet fully processed. In his coat pocket, folded once, was a still image printout from camera 94. He had taken it without quite deciding to. In it, she was mid-stride, bag over shoulder, corridor empty ahead of her. And at the very edge of the frame, in the half-second before she moved out of it, her profile showed something that Orville had spent 31 years learning to read and had, apparently, never actually understood. The face of a woman who knew exactly where she was going. The Committee for the Investigation of the Imperial Absence held its first formal session on the 4th day, which was considered, by those who convened it, to be admirably swift, and by everyone else to be 3 days too late. It met in the secondary council chamber, which was smaller than the primary chamber, and had a ceiling that had been doing something structurally ambiguous for several years. Not quite leaking, not quite not leaking, existing in a condition that the Facilities Division described officially as monitored moisture variance, and that everyone who sat beneath it described as that dripping sound. No one had fixed it during 19 years of imperial governance, because the Empress never used this room, and therefore no one had ever needed to explain it to her. Its sudden, necessary use now struck several people as the first concrete proof that her absence was already degrading the quality of their working conditions. Councillor Sav chaired the session. She had been chairing sessions for 32 years and had developed a technique for managing rooms full of intelligent, anxious people with competing agendas that amounted, essentially, to giving them all the impression that she had already made the decision and was merely allowing the discussion to proceed out of courtesy. It worked less well, she discovered, when the decision to be made was, what has happened to our Empress and how do we find her? Because this was not a question that responded to the technique of implied resolution. She chaired the session anyway, with the ferocity of someone who has decided that if she cannot solve the problem, she will at the very least run the meeting about it at a standard that reflects well on her. Admiral Das presented the search parameters. 47 vessels, distributed across the projected travel range, running, as he had suggested, under the designation of a training exercise. The designation was not believed by anyone. It was, however, maintained with such consistency and commitment by every officer involved that it achieved a kind of administrative reality, the way lies do when enough people of sufficient rank repeat them in formal contexts. His aide, a young lieutenant named Caro, who had recently transferred from the outer fleet and had not yet learned to modulate her expression during briefings, spent most of the presentation looking like someone watching a performance she was not entirely sure was serious. Pelion's report was brief. The vessel was untrackable by design. The Bay assignment had been entered into the Palace system 11 weeks prior, under credentials that had since been traced to a civilian contractor account that had been legitimately created, legitimately dormant for 6 years, and then legitimately reactivated in a single session from a terminal in the Palace's lower administrative wing. A terminal, Pelion noted, that had no surveillance coverage, owing to a maintenance gap that had been formally flagged for repair 14 months ago and had not yet been addressed. Pelion did not say someone planned this carefully. They did not need to. The room said it silently, in unison, while the ceiling did its ambiguous thing in the background. By the third month, the theories had achieved a sophistication that Orville, reading the intelligence summaries each morning with the resigned attention of a man completing a duty he no longer expects to enjoy, found almost impressive. The assassination theory had developed internal factions. The dominant strand held that she had been taken by an outer system separatist group, and the government was concealing it, which required the concealment of approximately 3,000 palace staff and several hundred fleet officers, which was the sort of operational security that the actual intelligence apparatus could not manage on a good day. But conspiracy theories are not bound by institutional realism. A minority strand of the assassination theory held that she had been taken by someone inside the government, which meant that every member of the council had, somewhere in the known systems, a constituency that believed them guilty of murder. Councillor Sav received this information and said, with perfect composure, that she had been called worse. The love theory arrived in the 6th week, carried into the inter-system gossip networks by a commentator on a mid-rim entertainment feed who had done no research but had, in compensation, considerable confidence. It spread with the particular velocity of ideas that people simultaneously believe are too absurd to take seriously and cannot stop repeating. It reached the council chamber in the form of a briefing note that Pelion had included under the heading Civilian Speculation, Low Probability Vectors, and which Das read with an expression suggesting he would prefer to be engaged in a firefight with an enemy he could locate. Love, he said flatly, to no one in particular. Someone is suggesting love. He said the word the way a structural engineer might say spontaneous combustion, while reviewing a load-bearing calculation, technically possible, inadmissible as an explanation. What no theory could account for, what all of them in their various ways stepped around without quite addressing, was the bag. One bag. Orville thought about the bag with a frequency he found professionally embarrassing. In 31 years, he had overseen the packing for her official travel. The ceremonial inventory alone required a dedicated team of 4 and a specialized storage hold on whatever vessel she occupied. The contents of any given diplomatic trip filled 17 standardized packing manifests, and she had left with one bag, over one shoulder, in the manner of someone who had decided that what they were going to did not require the weight of everything they were leaving behind. He could not make this fact mean anything useful. He could not stop trying. By the 6th month, the emergency sessions had become simply sessions. The emergency was still there. It had simply become the permanent condition, too sustained to be named with that word any longer, the way a very loud sound eventually becomes the sound of silence because the ear adjusts. 300 systems ran. Disputes stretched and strained and were managed, imperfectly, by people doing their best with tools calibrated for someone else's hands. And the chair at the head of the council table remained empty, and the ceiling in the secondary chamber continued its monitored moisture variance, and Orville folded and unfolded the image from camera 94 until the crease ran directly through the edge of her profile, through the expression he still could not name, through the face of a woman who had left them all behind and had not, as far as he could tell, looked back. The traffic controller who received the approach beacon at 9:43 Imperial Standard Time was a woman named Sebi, who had worked the Verath Prime lower orbital lane for 11 years and who prided herself, genuinely and with some justification, on having processed every conceivable category of incoming vessel without losing her professional composure. Cargo transports carrying livestock that should not have been licensed for atmospheric entry. A diplomat from the Vethani Outer Territories who had attempted to land a vessel the size of a small moon in a bay rated for personal shuttles, and who had argued about it. The time an automated freighter's navigation system had malfunctioned mid-approach, and the freighter had requested, in a flat synthetic voice, permission to land in the Imperial Garden. Sebi had handled all of it. She felt, in her better moments, that she was unshockable. The vessel that activated its beacon at 9:43 was a civilian transport of an older model, small, unexceptional, the sort of craft that processed through her lane 20 times a day without generating any particular feeling. It requested Bay 12. Sebi assigned it a queue position, logged the registration, and moved to the next incoming vessel. Then the registration resolved in her system, and she looked at Bay 12 again, and something in the sequence of those two facts, the registration, the bay, produced a sensation she could not immediately categorize. She put the channel on hold. She called her supervisor. Her supervisor looked at the registration. Her supervisor called his supervisor. His supervisor, who had been in the position for 2 years, and had spent a significant portion of that time being told there was a standing alert on Bay 12 without ever expecting it to activate, stared at his screen for a moment, and then did something that was technically outside his authority, but felt, in the circumstances, like the only reasonable response. He escalated it to Pellion's office directly, bypassing 4 intermediate steps in the communication protocol, and then sat back and felt simultaneously proud and terrified of himself. Pellion received the notification, read it again, and then did something that the 2 analysts present in the office had never seen Pellion do. They set down their tea without finishing it. By the time the shuttle entered the upper atmosphere, Counselor Sav had been woken. Admiral Das had been located in a posture of strategic rest that he described afterward as intentional. And Orvin Tail, who received the notification on a personal channel, on a handheld, in the middle of reviewing a catering inventory that suddenly seemed extraordinarily unimportant, had stood completely still for 10 seconds and then said, to the 3 staff members around him, "I'll need a formal reception arranged. Nothing too large. She won't want the fuss," and had straightened his jacket with the focus of a man redirecting an enormous quantity of complicated feeling into a task he knew how to do. The shuttle landed. The landing ramp extended. The assembled reception, which was nothing too large and was also quietly one of the more densely staffed arrivals in Bay 12's operational history, waited. The hatch opened. Seralith Vaan walked down the ramp, and everyone present experienced, in the same instant but in entirely different ways, the particular sensation of looking at something familiar and something new occupying the same space simultaneously. She was visibly pregnant. She was wearing clothes that bore no relation to anything in the imperial wardrobe. And she was smiling, not the diplomatic expression that her court had catalogued over 19 years of public function, the smile that communicated warmth as a policy position, but something without infrastructure behind it, something that simply existed on her face because it was there. Counselor Sav, who had prepared 3 different opening statements during the shuttle's descent and had selected the most measured of the 3 for delivery, opened her mouth. The prepared statement did not come out. What came out instead was, "Your Majesty, your," followed by a pause of a length that Fess, the junior attendant, later described to his flatmate as geological. The Empress looked at her with those flat silver eyes, and the smile shifted by a degree or two in a direction that suggested she was, on some level, enjoying this. "I know," she said. Her voice carried its harmonic undertone, that quiet doubled quality, and it sounded not different exactly, but as though the person producing it had changed its relationship to the sound. "I'll explain everything." Have someone bring my bag up and arrange the council for this afternoon." She paused. "Also, I've been thinking about the blue-grain soup from the kitchens for approximately 4 months, and I would like some immediately, please." She delivered the soup request with exactly the authority she used to settle trade disputes, and Orvin Tale, who had kept his composure through 11 months of the worst professional experience of his life, felt it fail him, not in grief, not in relief, but in something that arrived in his chest as laughter and exited with considerable effort as a cough. The council session that afternoon was the most attended meeting in the history of the imperial government. People with no formal council standing discovered urgent reasons to be in adjacent corridors. The security detail was present in numbers that would have been appropriate for an armed summit. Seralith entered last, as was custom, and took her seat with the uncomplicated ease of someone who has been sitting in that particular chair for 19 years and sees no reason to make an event of it. And she looked at the assembled faces of her government, all of them arranged in variations of the same expression. An expression that could be translated roughly as, "We have between 40 and 400 questions and cannot determine the order of priority." And she told them the shape of the truth. She had left because she had needed to. She had been gone for a year. She was back. She was pregnant, and the pregnancy was not a matter for council review, and the identity of the other parent was not a matter for council review, and the succession implications were a matter she had already begun drafting proposals for and would present to the legal division by end of week. She was, in every capacity relevant to the governance of 300 star systems, entirely herself. She intended to resume full duties the following morning. She would be taking no further questions on the personal dimension of her absence. She delivered all of this in the composed, precise register that her advisors had spent 11 months missing, and with the smile still present at the edges, not performing anything, not managing any impression, simply there, as though she had found it somewhere during the year she was gone and had decided this time to bring it home. She returned to work on a Wednesday, which was, in the estimation of the Imperial Calendar Division, a perfectly ordinary day, and which was, in the estimation of everyone who witnessed it, anything but. By 8, she had reviewed 6 months of accumulated governance reports. By 9:30, she had resolved the border dispute between the two midrim systems in a single session. 4 sentences, 1 look, the particular silence that followed the look, and then signatures. And the delegation from both systems left the chamber with the expressions of people who had prepared for a long negotiation, and had instead been handed the answer and shown the door. Admiral Das, who had sat in on the session as a precaution he could not entirely justify professionally, watched her work and felt something he had not felt in 11 months, which was the specific comfort of a man who has remembered that the machine he is part of has its most important component back. He did not say this. He was not a man who said things of that nature, but he stood a fraction straighter on his way out, and Lieutenant Caro, who had learned by now to read him, noticed. The succession code revision arrived in the legal division's communications queue on Friday morning, 4 days after she had promised it, and the head of the division, a careful, technically minded woman named Hoth, who had spent the intervening days preparing a comprehensive briefing on the statutory obstacles she expected to discuss, read through the proposed revisions with the experience of someone expecting inadequacy and the bewilderment of someone finding the opposite. The revisions addressed every statutory complication. They resolved 3 ambiguities in the existing code that had been sitting unaddressed for 60 years, not because no one had noticed them, but because correcting them would have required the kind of political will that most administrations preferred to spend on other things. Hoth read the document twice, summoned her 2 senior counsels, watched them read it, and then said, in the tone of someone reporting a mildly unusual weather pattern, "She's already thought of everything we were going to raise." Her senior counsel looked up. "All of it," said Hoth, "and several things we hadn't gotten to yet. There was a pause. Then her second counsel, a young man named Driv who had joined the division 18 months ago and still occasionally asked questions that revealed he had not yet fully calibrated the nature of his employer, said, "Should we suggest something so it looks like we contributed?" Hoth considered this briefly. "Write a favorable cover memo," she said, "and be grateful." The Vethani rebellion, which had spent 11 months accruing significance from the government's distraction, discovered in the space of a single terse communication from the palace that significance borrowed from someone else's crisis does not survive the resolution of that crisis. The communication was not threatening. It did not need to be. It was simply precise, and it arrived with the implicit weight of an administration that had returned to full operational capacity and had noted with perfect composure that certain things had been occurring in its peripheral vision and was now looking directly at them. The rebellion did not dissolve immediately. These things never dissolve immediately, they deflate. But it deflated with the particular speed of something that had been inflated by absence and could not sustain itself against presence. Orvintale observed all of this with the attention of a man who has spent 31 years watching someone work, and is only now, in the contrast of her return against her absence, understanding what he was watching. He had always known she was exceptional. You could not stand in proximity to exceptional governance for 3 decades without knowing it. But knowing it and understanding it were different things, and what her absence had done, what 11 months of watching everyone else struggle with tools calibrated for her hands had accomplished, was to make the understanding visceral in a way that knowledge never quite manages. He had seen what the empire looked like without her at its center. He did not want to see it again. What he had not expected to see was what the empire looked like with her at its center, and also this changed. The governance was the same. The authority was the same. The precision, the intelligence, the particular quality of her attention that made people in her presence feel both assessed and, unexpectedly, seen, all of it intact, all of it operating at the standard it always had. But there was a seam of something new running through the familiar material, visible if you knew where to look, which Orvintale, after 31 years, did. She asked after people now, in passing, with a specificity that suggested she actually wanted the answer. She had requested, twice in the first week, that the blue-grain soup appear on the lunch menu, not as a sovereign demand, but as a preference stated aloud to a kitchen staff that had spent 11 months cooking for an empty seat, and responded to the request with an enthusiasm that was almost alarming. She walked differently. She paused sometimes between one obligation and the next, in the corridor outside her quarters, with her hand resting against herself in the particular way of someone checking in, with a fact they are still getting used to being glad about. Pelion closed the investigation file on a Thursday evening, 6 weeks after the return. Formally, the case remained open. Officially, there was a standing directive to identify any security vulnerabilities that had enabled the unauthorized departure of an imperial sovereign. Functionally, Pelion had resolved every practical question and had arrived at the only remaining one, the one that was not a security matter and was not their professional domain, and was not, if they were being honest with themselves, something they had any right to pursue. They knew the shape of where she had gone. They had the partial beacon trace, the route, the unlogged space lanes. They did not have the name or the face or the planet, and they were not going to look for them. And they had decided this not because of any policy consideration, but because of a conviction they could not have produced a professional justification for. That whatever she had found in the year she was gone belonged to her in a way that even the Empire did not. They closed the file. They finished their tea, which had gone cold. They thought briefly about the other parent, whoever they were, wherever they were, living without the knowledge that a person they had known for a year was currently revising succession code and resolving border disputes and carrying. In some quiet interior place, she did not open for public viewing, whatever it was she had brought back from the time she spent being known only as herself. Pelion hoped, with a sincerity that surprised them, that the person had been worth it. Then they decided that they obviously had been, because the evidence was sitting at the head of the council table every morning with a smile that had not been there before, governing 300 star systems with the same precision as always and the additional quality of someone who has remembered, against the considerable odds of their life, what it is to be glad. The last thing Orvin Tale did that evening, before he locked his office and walked the east corridor on the route he had walked for 31 years, was take the image from his coat pocket, the still from camera 94, creased now along a line that ran through the edge of her profile, and look at it one final time. Then he put it in his desk drawer because it no longer felt like a mystery to solve. She had left to find something. She had found it. She had come back, and she had brought it with her, and it was visible every day in the governance of 300 systems and in the blue-grain soup on the lunch menu, and in the smile that no one had seen before she left and that no one now could quite imagine her without. He turned off his office light. He walked the east corridor. Outside the palace walls, Vareth Prime hummed at its nighttime register, and above it, 300 star systems ran precisely, imperfectly, entirely alive, under the care of a woman who had gone away to remember that ruling a universe and living in it were not, if you were paying attention, the same thing at all.